The Omsk, a Soviet cargo ship, has crossed the Atlantic. It sits waiting in a Cuban port. The first shipment of medium-range ballistic missiles, RR-12s, is on board. At night, all lights are off, on the ship and in the port. Out at sea, boats protect the entrance to the harbor. Road access is guarded by Cuban troops. Underwater, divers check the ship's hull, and every 2 hours, the water around the Omsk. Premier Nikita Khrushchev believes the Americans are preparing to attack Cuba. He's alarmed by Kennedy's warning that the United States have evidence of anti-aircraft missiles on Cuba, and that America will use whatever means necessary to defend itself. Khrushchev responds with his own statement on September 11th. If this attack is made, it will be the beginning of the unleashing of war, he says. And also, our weapons are so powerful, we don't need to put them outside the Soviet Union. But the Soviet R-12 missiles are already on Cuban soil. They were unloaded 2 days earlier. This is the bomb.
Thank you. I have a preliminary statement.
The United States has missed the arrival of the Omsk in Cuba and its secret cargo below deck. From early September, for several weeks, there are no U-2 spy planes watching from above. The Americans, too, are working in darkness. But Washington knows that something is going on, and President Kennedy talks to the press on the 13th of September.
Ever since communism moved into Cuba in 1958, Soviet technical and military personnel have moved steadily onto the island in increasing numbers at the invitation of the Cuban government. Now that movement has been increased.
On September 16th, the head of the CIA, John McCone, cables again from his honeymoon in the south of France. He has intelligence on the secret movement of missiles. But phoning it in from so far away makes no impact. His deputy, General Marsh Carter, doesn't share those cables with the White House. Somehow, a Republican Senator, Kenneth Keating, is also getting information on a missile buildup. And throughout September, Keating is publicly badgering President Kennedy to take action, even accusing the president of deceiving Americans by not telling them what is going on in Cuba.
The CIA officially disagreed with the CIA's director. The CIA's expert estimators on September 19th issue a national intelligence estimate arguing that Khrushchev will not put nuclear missiles in Cuba because it's too risky and the Soviet Union hadn't sent nuclear missiles outside Soviet territory before. Actually, we've learned since the end of the Cold War they did. They sent some nuclear medium-range missiles to East Germany during the Berlin crisis, but those who had intelligence about that did not tell those who were preparing the estimate about Khrushchev sending missiles to Cuba.
President Kennedy and his team try to figure out what Khrushchev is up to throughout September.
This country will do whatever must be done to protect its own security and that of its allies.
The missiles are unloaded carefully in closed ports under strict secrecy. That secrecy has to be maintained as the weapons are moved around the island. Some will have to be taken hundreds of miles through mountainous terrain. As a missile truck column prepares to depart at night, a car accident is staged along the route. The road is closed to locals because of the fake crash. A decoy column is dispatched on a false itinerary an hour before the real one leaves. Then, the trucks begin their journey across Cuba. Bridges have been reinforced and new roads built to accommodate the huge trucks to transport the missiles.
So when the Soviets bring the missiles to Cuba, they do have to displace quite a few families to make room for the new bases. And they have to move these giant missiles around. They try to do so at night. They try to keep them under cover. Occasionally, they have to knock down buildings so that they can maneuver the missiles around these small streets. So it is quite disruptive to have the missiles arriving. And people joke that there must be importing palm trees because that's kind of the size and shape of the missiles. But there's a sense that this is a government secret that they should respect.
Once the missiles have arrived, the plan to use tree cover doesn't work. There aren't enough palm trees, and conditions for the Soviet troops are getting difficult.
The food supply that they have, because it's rain season, food gets spoiled very, very soon, and you have all sorts of creatures in your porridge, in your kasha. And some of the Soviet officers described the episode like there will be a Potemkin-type mutiny where, because of the spoiled food, the revolutionary upheaval started on the Black Sea Fleet in 1905. So they all watched Battleship Potemkin. They know what comes next. So the way the commanders deal with that, they go and see the soldiers and say that, yeah, it's a difficult situation, but do you think that you eat a different sort of food that me and my commissar eats? Yeah, yesterday we had a lunch, so we found a couple of those creatures. We threw them away and finished our food. But that maybe raised morale for a few hours. But once people started to get diarrhea, that was a big issue.
In tropical storms and high humidity, launch pads for the missiles are built by hand. It's hurricane season, and temperatures are between 35 and 40 degrees Celsius. Crews are changed every hour.
President Kennedy is warning Khrushchev publicly and privately not to put offensive weapons in Cuba. Khrushchev promises not to, but he is manipulating the president.
Of course, from Khrushchev's point of view, Khrushchev says at one point, well, if you have a gun in your hand, the gun can be either defensive or offensive, depending on how you want to use it. And from his point of view, these missiles are not offensive. He doesn't plan to use them against the United States. He plans to use them to defend Cuba. So in his mind, he's not lying to Kennedy.
The U.S. would say that the nuclear weapons it's sending to Germany are defensive because they're meant to deter a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Likewise, the Soviets would say, oh, we are only sending weapons to Cuba to deter an American attack on Cuba. However, these are missiles that could reach New York, Washington, Los Angeles, Dallas, as well as crucial military targets with nuclear weapons. And so to Kennedy, these are offensive weapons.
Or he would consider them offensive if he knew about them. Meanwhile, he is playing down the likelihood of conflict.
I would hope that the future record will show that the only people talking about a war or an invasion at this time are the communist spokesmen in Moscow and Havana, and that the American people, defending as we do so much of the free world, will in this nuclear age, as they have in the past, keep both their nerve and their head.
Private communications, the so-called pen pal correspondence between Khrushchev and Kennedy, continue. Khrushchev's letter of September 28th is long, almost 4,500 words. He agrees enthusiastically to the nuclear test ban treaty. He describes Berlin as something that can make our relations feverish and sometimes bring them to a red-hot glow. He promises again to do nothing about Berlin until after the November elections. But he makes it clear he is irritated that Kennedy has asked Congress for authority to call up 150,000 reservists. This is oil to the flame. Khrushchev says, "We haven't done anything that could give a pretext for that. We did not carry out any mobilization and did not make any threats."
President Kennedy replies, a much shorter letter. He ignores the question of Berlin, focusing on the test ban treaty. They should work towards the date in January, as agreed. He says that he's glad that they can continue to use this channel as a means of communicating privately and frankly.
This will be the last written correspondence between them before the situation becomes a global crisis.
Messages are also passing between them through diplomats, and at the same time between my father, Robert F. Kennedy, and Georgy Bolshakov. Bolshakov is the KGB spy who by this point has visited my father's home several times. He even taught my older siblings Cossack dancing. Bolshakov visits the Attorney General in his office in early October. He notices that Robert Kennedy is not his usual friendly self. He's a little distant and tense. Most of their conversations have been off the record, but this time my father takes careful notes. Bolshakov repeats the promise from Khrushchev. The Soviets are only putting defensive weapons in Cuba.
Bolshakov is lying. Well, he's not lying in the sense that he's deliberately telling a falsehood, but he is conveying inaccurately to Kennedy through the back channel nothing about the deployment of the missiles.
The Soviet cargo ship named Indigirka has crossed the Atlantic and is passing along the north coast of Cuba. The ship carries a special cargo, the first nuclear warheads to arrive on Cuba. They will be paired with the missiles delivered by the Omsk a month earlier. It's October 4th. Khrushchev's project is almost complete. He can reveal to Kennedy what he has done soon, after the midterm elections on November 6.
He thinks that he hit a jackpot with this young and inexperienced president, whom he believes he can manipulate. So he wants to keep him in power. So his plan is to talk to Kennedy, and by that time the missiles would be fully operational, and it would be actually too late to do anything about the missiles. Going into Cuba would mean starting the nuclear war, and he assumed that, of course, Kennedy would never do that.
The warheads will be stored separately from the missile sites. They're unloaded quietly onto canvas-covered military trucks and then driven to warehouses in the mountains over 1,000 kilometers away. The Soviets get lucky. Because of the cloud cover, there are still no U-2 reconnaissance flights. They're able to get their equipment in position without the Americans seeing them. They can get on with their work in secret.
U.S. Air Force pilot Major Richard Heiser sits in the cockpit of his U-2 spy plane. Heiser wears a pressurized flight suit to protect him at high altitude. He takes off from Edwards Air Force Base in California shortly before midnight. It's the 14th of October, and this is Mission 3101. Overflights of Cuba have been resumed at the urging of the head of the CIA, John McCone, who's finally returned from his honeymoon. And the clouds have cleared for the first time in weeks. By sunrise, Heiser is flying north over the western part of Cuba and activates his tracking cameras. He has to fly a straight and steady course in order to take good, clear photographs. This makes him an easy target for the Russian surface-to-air missiles. Heiser looks out ahead for the wisps of smoke that indicate a SAM has been fired at him. He will fly more than 6 hours to take 6 minutes of photos. His cameras will capture 928 sharp images. He touches down safely at McCoy Air Force Base in Florida at 9:20 a.m. Eastern Time, and the film canisters are removed from the plane. 3 hours later, the photographs are being analyzed at the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, and experts work through the night trying to figure out what's happening in Cuba.
These reconnaissance photographs from Cuba, they're taken from 70, 80,000 feet, and they only show a few dots in a field. But by measuring the size of these dots, the CIA established that some of these dots are Soviet medium-range nuclear missiles that can reach as far as Washington and, in fact, also New York.
They can see a Soviet-style construction site, a launch platform for medium-range ballistic missiles, and beside it, 6 canvas-covered cylinders, each more than 60 feet long.
The reason the CIA is able to identify these missiles in a field in Cuba is that they have seen exactly the same missile paraded in the May Day parades in Red Square that are held annually. US military attachés have actually taken photographs of these same missiles in Red Square. They know exactly the length of the missiles, and by comparing the U-2 spy imagery, they're able to precisely identify what kind of missiles Khrushchev has sent to Cuba.
At 8 a.m. on October 16th, President Kennedy is still in bed examining the New York Times. He reads that former President Eisenhower has publicly attacked him and his overeducated advisors, calling their foreign policy sophisticated nonsense. Until this assault, former presidents had followed an unwritten rule that you don't undermine your successor, especially on foreign affairs. It's a bad start to the day. Moments later, McGeorge Bundy, his national security advisor, rushes up to the president's bedroom on the second floor of the White House and knocks urgently. The president, still in his pajamas, answers, and Bundy hurries to tell him that the U-2 has found proof. The Soviets have placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. President Kennedy swears, astonished, and says he can't do this to me.
Kennedy feels incredibly betrayed by Khrushchev because Khrushchev has repeated, and other Soviet officials have repeated, that they're not going to send offensive missiles to Cuba. And suddenly the CIA has established beyond any reasonable doubt that, in fact, Khrushchev has sent these missiles, and therefore Khrushchev has been lying to him.
He feels personally offended. Later that day, he'll call Khrushchev a liar and an immoral gangster. But the first thing President Kennedy does as he takes in the news is call his brother, Robert Kennedy. The president tells my father, "We have some big trouble."
On the morning of October 16th, Bobby Kennedy's at the Justice Department, and he gets a call saying, "You got to come over here," from his brother. "You got to come over here right away." And he comes to the White House and enters the office of the National Security Advisor, Mac Bundy, and he's shown these photographs, CIA U-2 spy plane photographs of the missile sites. He's been lied to by Bolshakov. There are offensive missiles in Cuba aimed at the United States. It's, I think the president says, a dagger to our gut. And they know right away they're going to have to do something about them. It's just unacceptable to have those missiles there.
I just wanted to ask you, this question of lying, it seems that President Kennedy and my father are just absolutely offended that Georgy Bolshakov, that Khrushchev, that even the foreign minister have all basically lied to them to their face. And that could severely damage the relationship, damage their ability to do things over the long term, to cooperate on the test ban. Do you notice a difference between the West and Russia in that regard?
Well, it's not as if the Kennedys never lied. So lies are a tool of statecraft. Winston Churchill in World War II talked about the bodyguard of lies. But it does make it harder to deal with somebody. You can't trust the other side if they're going to lie to you.
This is day one of the 13 days of the missile crisis, Tuesday, October 16th, 1962. Soon after hearing the news, President Kennedy chooses the men he wants to assemble to help him figure out what to do next. He pulls in people with a wide array of political views and expertise, military and civilian leaders, foreign policy experts, and trusted friends. And, importantly, people he disagrees with, too. He dictates the list to McGeorge Bundy.
The Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM for short, is a group of senior officials that will advise John F. Kennedy during these 13 days, and it is a formidable group. I mean, the credentials that these gentlemen bring to the table is impressive.
The group includes his foreign policy team, Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, and Dean Rusk. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior uniformed leaders within the U.S. Department of Defense, are there along with the head of the CIA. My father, Robert Kennedy, will lead the group whenever the president is unable to attend, and on his behalf, push them to consensus.
What is notable about them, certainly in hindsight, and boy was it evident also during the deliberations, is the degree to which they are, to use the later Vietnam-era term, hawkish. A majority of them are insisting on the need to use military force to remove the installations. So many of these men were pushing Kennedy in that direction. He himself, I think, in the first 2-3 days of the crisis, thought that the military option would probably have to be used.
My father's memoir, 13 Days, written a couple of years after the crisis, begins on the morning of Tuesday, October 16th, and will define the narrative around the missile crisis for decades. On page 1, he writes, "From that moment in President Kennedy's office until Sunday morning, October 28th, that was my life. And for Americans and Russians, for the whole world, it was their life as well." A kind of mythology builds up around these meetings, partly because of the book, that they are a group of wise men who, in the face of this extreme threat, remain unruffled and logical in their decision-making. But then, tapes of the meetings begin to surface from 1985 onwards, which reveal that the men are divided, confused, and often frightened. And there are question marks over the judgment of the military Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Particularly what we're going to do about it. Maybe a lot of people don't know about what's there, but what we're going to do about it really ought to be.
President Kennedy himself had installed extensive taping devices in the Oval Office and in the Cabinet Room, very close to the Oval Office. But it's a room with a long table for a bigger meeting. And he would activate the tapes by pressing a button, unbeknownst to the other people in the meeting. JFK never explained why he installed the taping system in the summer of 1962. But he was getting a lot of terrible advice from his military advisors. It was an era in which one often measured one's value to the president by how interventionist the advice was, and he was angry that he got so much bad advice.
Should we proceed the military action or political action? If so, on what timing? I would think the answer is almost certainly yes.
On that first day, President Kennedy and his advisors think they have about a week to come to a decision before the news is leaked. And at this stage, neither Khrushchev nor Castro knows that the missiles have been discovered. Over the next 6 days, the group will debate their options. Whether to issue Khrushchev an ultimatum to remove the missiles, bomb the missile sites, or invade Cuba.
And these men meet secretly, very secretly. They don't want the world to find out about it. One time when they're going to the White House, they all climb into a limousine together, sitting on each other's lap. And they meet to try to figure out what to do.
The group needs to settle on a way to force the Russians to give up their missiles, but without starting a nuclear war.
There's an almost complete agreement at the table. One way or another, we're going to get rid of those missiles. The only question is, do we do it with a surprise military attack? Do we also invade Cuba? And only at the margins is there any talk about, well, let's try diplomacy first.
There's a powerful sense of the rush of time. On tape, as he has to leave for an appointment, you can hear President Kennedy say, "I just hate to waste even these 6 hours."